Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for joining the Climate Adaptation Seminar Series. So this series, as I mentioned, is being supported by the Climate Adaptation Research Center. It's to showcase the latest research done on the UC Davis campus relating to climate adaptation. Today's webinar is about the many new satellites and airborne instruments under development that will collect data for climate adaptation research and is presented by Dr. Susan Ustin. Dr. Susan Ustin has 35 years of experience in working with remote sensing instruments to study and understand ecosystem processes. Her research has focused on detection of eco-physiological traits and processes in relation to remotely sensed characterization of stressed vegetation from climate variability and change. Her work includes wildfire-related research at local to regional scales that address risk, mitigation, and adaptation. Dr. Ustin's research also includes forest structure, drought, and wildfire risk, quantifying live fuel loads, and recovery after wildfire. She has also worked on impacts of multiple stressors, including Gulf oil spills and subsequent hurricane damage. Thank you so much, Susan, for joining us today. I will let you take it away.
All right, thank you very much. I seem to be continuously bothered by asthma these days, and so if I have to start sucking a throat lozenge, I will. Anyway, let me put it on there. Can you see this first slide?
We cannot yet.
Okay, let's see. I need to go back here and share screen, share screen, and try again. How about this time?
We can see it.
Great. So there are a lot of new satellites that are either in orbit right now or under development and plan to be launched in the next several years, and representing kind of several continuing technologies and some newer technologies that are, because of the higher spatial resolution, probably are of more recent interest to people in climate adaptation research. And so these technologies are the traditional ones, which are the multi-spectral satellites. They have a few bands in the solar part of the spectrum, so in the visible and the near infrared, or sometimes in a thermal band. And those represent the kind of long-term data stream that we have to look back and try to quantify change over several decades now. The other technologies that have really are under active development are multi-spectral thermal. So it's more than just one band, 5 bands, 6 bands, hyperspectral even with multiple bands is kind of on the horizon. What do you do with those? Well, you can measure different kinds of materials in the thermal infrared, just like you do in the other parts of the spectrum. We have new lidar sensors that measure the 3-dimensional structure of the surface. And we have new radar sensors that are also measuring kind of mostly the 3-dimensional structure, but also are sensitive to things like the freeze or thaw state of polar regions and frozen regions. And then lastly, the hyperspectral imagers that are the high spectral resolution data sets that allow you to measure quantitatively more specific materials. So with that, I want to go on. So this is from Landsat from a couple of weeks ago. You see all of our recent fires. So this is a very typical kind of image that people would look at and try to analyze what happened in those fires, what got burned, what didn't get burned, why didn't it get burned, what was the conditions at the site that promoted the fire and so on. There are lots of kind of geospatial questions that might be of interest for climate adaptation research. So I tried to just come up with a few of them since I knew you're all on mute and you can't actually directly ask me a question except send something in the Q&A. So things related to population density, both human and plant. How are things changing? What are they changing in relation to land use, to changes in temperatures, weather extremes, and so on, both for people and for plants. We'd like to know more about the animal populations, but they're usually inferred from the structure of the plant community. We'd like to measure things related to biodiversity losses and in terms of invasive species. How are the native communities, how are they retaining their structure and what's going on? Things related to carbon and nutrient budgets, things like carbon sequestration or emissions. What's the net ecosystem exchange, or what's happening with chlorophyll fluorescence given a massive drought in the Western US? What about methane emissions? Where are they coming from? Water budgets, and so on. You can read all these kind of questions, and I'm sure you have 10 times more questions than I just put down, but I wanted to put some kinds of things that related to either the chemical and biochemical and the physical processes of the materials, or related to the structural properties of the materials. What's the height distribution in the forest? What's the gap size distribution? What's the size of the stand? How tall are the trees? How tall is the lowest branches in the canopy? How close to the ground are they? Things like that would be of interest to different types of adaptation questions. So right now, NASA's got lots of Earth observing satellites. So these are the missions that are either active now or are being planned for between now and 2 years from now. So then the near term. And you see we have a whole bunch of them on the space station, on the International Space Station, with several new instruments with new technologies that are quite interesting, and also they're usually high spatial resolution, high meaning kind of at the size of Landsat pixels, not at weather satellite pixels. Some of these have been launched. Landsat 9 just got launched about a week ago into space, so we have both Landsat 8 and 9 operating. The Sentinel 6 was launched I think about 6 or 8 months ago. And so it's a new one. NISAR is supposed to be launched this year. I think it's coming right up. It's a radar instrument. So you have a whole bunch of these that are under development, and then some longer term instruments. So I'm going to go through a few of them, not cover all of these things, but just to show you there are a lot of instruments that are being operated by NASA that are in space or planned for in space for Earth observation. The European Space Agency has a similar suite of instruments, and this graph shows has been launched from 2010 up to, and then into the future up to 2030, what's expected. And they have their satellites kind of organized by Earth explorers, which are the more one-off kind of instruments to demonstrate a technology. The Sentinel satellites, that's more like the Landsat ones that are meant to be operational for operational environmental use, and then the weather satellites, which are also operational. These are the kind of suite of satellites you have to pick from, because these are all free and open data policies, so you have access to all of the data without cost, and the data quality is quite high with all of these. So here's a little table that shows from high spatial resolution, which means something about 30 meters or less pixel size. And you see different types of technology. Panchromatic, you've got a couple of instruments with a panchromatic band. Usually they're higher resolution than the other multispectral bands in the same instrument. So that gives you an opportunity to quote pan sharpen those other bands, meaning to use the high spatial resolution, the variability between pixels in those to adjust the spatial resolution in your coarser data. You have a number of multispectral image instruments in space now that are all available in this free and open data policy. 2 fluorescence imagers. The Flex is going up sometime later this year, and next year, and OCO3 is on the space station now. Hyperspectral, you have a whole series of them that are Prisma's in space now, DESA's in the space station, NMAP's going up next year. This one's been replaced by Biodiversity is the new name of the French satellite. HISUI is on the space station, EMIT's going on the space station next year, and SVG is NASA's main hyperspectral imager that will be a global mapping imager, and it's coordinated with the European CHIME instrument. And so both of these will be in space and with very similar characteristics and operated at 180 degrees offset from each other. So you double the mapping frequency. And these multiband thermal instruments, EcoStress is on the space station, and this LSTM is a European satellite that's going to be in the Landsat orbit, and at a little bit later in the morning than Landsat passes, but will provide another high resolution thermal imagery. And then we go down to moderate ones, which are the kind of MODIS, kind of 500 to 1,000 meter pixels. And we have quite a few of those, both in space now and coming up. And then, of course, the weather satellites at the bottom. And I don't want to go through every one, but just to say there are a lot of them that are potential interest. Most of these, if you think about them in 3 dimensions, spatial, spectral, and temporal, they kind of cluster in different parts of the space. They're not distributed over all of them. Most of these satellites are in the kind of somewhere between less than 10 meter pixels to 100 meter pixels. And some are down to, these commercial ones are down to 1 meter pixels from space. And usually those don't have as many spectral bands, so they're kind of at the low end of the spectral band range. And then you get to the hyperspectral ones at the 30 meter pixels, they're way up here with lots and lots of bands, hundreds of bands, usually somewhere between 200 and 400 spectral bands per pixel. And then in terms of temporal resolution, you have some like the geostationary satellites that are routinely giving 10-minute spatial repeat coverage for the disk of the Earth. And then you go out to some that are in the 1-day intervals, like the planned land surface thermal mapping unit, LSTM. That's a daily or sub-daily at PACE, that's an oceanography mission. And then some that are out between, say, a week to somewhere between a week and a month. And that's where most of those fit. So you have these things clustered, and you have to kind of decide what's the information you need the most. Is it the better temporal resolution, or the better spectral resolution, or the spatial resolution? Because you never, well, it's very hard to get all 3 on the same instrument. So I want to start with talking about active sensors. Those are radar and lidar. They emit a signal, and then they detect the return. So when it bounces off an object and bounces back in the direction of the satellite, it gets counted. And so they use those returns to then estimate what the height of objects are. And by knowing the height of the object from the surface, then you can get the the relative height of the object, as opposed to the geoidal, I guess, height of the object. So these give you information about the 3-dimensional structure, the surface topography, and if it's high resolution, you can get microtopography. So anything about drainage patterns or other kinds of conditions that would be appropriate for your climate adaptation research. For above ground vegetation structure, you get everything from maximum and minimum height to mean height, canopy volume, the vertical structure of the vegetation, stand sizes and gap sizes, and extent of, and then as I mentioned before, and radar is sensitive to the dielectric constant of the material, and so it can measure what the state of water is, whether it's frozen or liquid. And then the kind of instruments we have to measure those are the JEDI on the space station, and I'll show you some really nice data from that. Sentinel-1, which is in orbit, that's the European Sentinel radar instrument, and coming up NISAR, which is a joint NASA Indian Space Agency radar that will have 2 bands, L and S bands. anyway, so just to give you an example of what you might want to know, you'd like to know the biomass of the surface and how it varies across the surface or in relation to some other information like plant distribution or something. So you can use lidar alone, or you can use lidar fused with some other information. And in the right-hand side is this TerraSAR-X is a commercial German satellite that measures surface topography at a meter scale. It's commercial, so you have to pay for it, but it's quite amazing instrument. So you could get things, lots of things that you want to know about a height or biomass or other kinds of three-dimensional information. The lidars work like this. They send a signal down, and the tallest object will send it back first. So the time between the sending and return is the shortest, and that makes it the tallest object. And so you get a distribution like this. That's really a distribution in time it takes for the signal to get back to the satellite. And you always have a big noise around the ground area because sometimes things get bounced around and they don't maybe go directly to the ground and directly back to the satellite. So you get a little bit of noise around the ground level. But you get once you get that distribution, here's our spot size for the emissions from the satellite, and then you get a distribution of what the trees look like. Here's one tall tree and a bunch of little ones. So here's an example of JEDI data from a couple months ago. That's actually, it's a fusion between Landsat and the JEDI. JEDI is the lidar data, and that's what you see on the right is the vertical profile for that whole vegetated part of Africa, and you see the general height distributions across these areas. So what they're doing is using Landsat to determine where there's vegetation, and then using the JEDI data to determine the height. Another example of pure JEDI data is from the Colex River, which is just north of the Columbia River at the border of Washington and Oregon. And this tributary goes down to the Columbia, and you see the transect in green. And then below it, you see what the vertical distribution of returns were for that line segment. But then you also see what the individual tree distributions are. So you see some gaps where there are no trees or very small trees, and what you have some amazingly tall ones, more than 80 meters. These Northwest conifer forests are the tallest forests in the world, so they're exceptionally tall. Then you switch to the lowland Amazon, not too far from the Atlantic, and here you have very dense forest. It certainly, the darker it is where the most returns are coming from. So that's the densest part of the canopy. And here you see that it's very dense, but it's only about 30 meters tall as opposed to 50 meters tall in these forests. Another kind of vertical information that you might be interested in is sea surface height. And we measure that with an altimeter, a radar altimeter that also emits a signal and measures the return time. And you see examples of the new Sentinel 6, which is the European instrument, but it's named after Michael Freilich, who was an oceanographer from University of Washington before he went to NASA headquarters and headed up the Earth Science Division at NASA headquarters for many years. And here you see the JA3, that's the Jason 3 instrument. That's the one there's been a series of Jason 1, 2, and 3, and we're currently on Jason 3, and it's being replaced or added to by Sentinel 6 as a way of comparing what they are, where these ascending and descending paths cross each other. And then here you see where you have lots of cities and urban areas all around the world that are at risk because of sea level rise. So another example of this is more in looking at some just undulating terrain. And here you see this box is where the Sentinel 1, which is the European satellite, radar satellite, collected data. And here you see the color pattern goes from low to high. From high to low. From green is high and low is red, what the spatial patterns look like. And then the other images have to do with the variance and the error estimates and so on. But this one matches that. And you can see here are these lowland lakes, and here are the 1, 2, 3 of them that match that pattern. And another place. So these are things you can do to try to understand why do you have the kind of spatial variation you have in land cover type. So with multispectral imagery, which is the long-term where the long-term time series is, since Landsat goes back to 1972, these instruments have between 4 and 14 bands, and so they're either all in the solar part of the spectrum or the solar plus the one band in the thermal infrared. Landsat data does go back to 1972, but it's not easy to find a complete data set back that far. Usually it's about 1986 is about the best you can do. But there are the archives are there, and if you need to go back that far, you might potentially you can find them, but you can certainly get about a 50-year sequence with the Landsat now, a 45-year sequence. So there's lots of things you can measure related to land cover and changes in land cover, the seasonal growth patterns by knowing the timing of the growth from the repeated coverage. You can do disturbance mapping. That's a big lot of interest in that. You can look at changes in agriculture, what type of crop they're growing, what changes in agricultural practices happen, and what that does to the growth. The phenology, measuring the GPP and NPP is a very common use of it. And we do have several instruments, Landsats 8 and 9, since 9 just got launched last week. The Sentinel 2s, there's an A and a B, Sentinel 2. So between the 16-day repeats for these, which with 2 of them, you get an 8-day repeat coverage, and these have a 10-day repeat coverage. So you have 4 instruments, you have now about 2 to 3 day repeat coverage globally by combining data from those 2 instruments. And you can either do it yourself, or NASA has a product where it's already merged. And then you have MODIS and VIIRS and the European MARIS, which is not operating now, but has a long time series. MODIS is about the end of its life also. These are the kind of intermediate scale instruments that are global mapping instruments for anything related to multispectral kind of questions. And they cover back into the 1990 timeframe. Then you have a whole series of very high, super high spatial resolution ones. I mentioned Planet, which is in San Francisco, Iconos, GeoEye, Spot, Worldview. They're commercial, they're sort of expensive, but if you need 1 meter data for your site, it's available. Actually, if any federal agency has bought the data for their research and you're doing something similar, you can get their data. They will give you their data and you can get it from the agencies. So having all of the spectral bands allows you to see different kinds of information that show up in different parts of the spectrum because of the chemical properties of the material. So obviously in the visible, plants are dominated by photosynthetic pigments. And that's the kind of information you get from having multiple bands in the visible part of the spectrum. But it's, okay. Anyway, that's the information that's used to do all the land cover mapping and so on, because variations in pigment density and so on, leaf area index, cause changes in the appearance of the vegetation. So that's how it's used to map it. In the middle of the range, from the about 700 nanometers out to 1500 nanometers, is mostly related to things related to leaf structure. So it's more scattering, a scattering process. And then in the longer wavelengths from 1500 to 2500 is primarily water and biochemicals in the leaves. There are two water absorption features in the near infrared, one at about 970 nanometers and one about 1240 nanometers. And you can use the depth of those water absorption features, the variation in the depth of that, to measure the water content of the vegetation, for instance. So there's a lot of different kinds of information you can get from different parts of the spectrum. So here's an example of Landsat data for the recent fires that we just have had, showing you where they are. And here's the nice land cover map for California, showing the vegetated parts all green and the desert and low vegetation parts in shades of brown. And here you see why we have so many fires. We've had lots and lots of extreme drought in the recent years, and it seems to be getting worse. And so as a result, we're back in another drought. And here you look at a time series. This is from 1984 to 2017. Well, how has the vegetation changed around the Santa Rosa area compared to more current? And this, you can look at the changes, and here you easy to see the recent burns from 3 or 4 years ago. And also the change in the size of the city shows up. So that's another use of it. Since Landsat 9 was just launched, which is a big event that's been waited for a long time. It just was launched last week. So we now have these combined Landsat and Sentinel data sets to get the 2 to 3 or 2 to 4 day repeat coverage. Sentinel 2 has 13 bands. Landsat has 8 bands plus the 2 thermal bands. Sentinel doesn't have any thermal bands, and Sentinel has 10 and has some the red and the near infrared bands at 10 meters, and the rest of their bands at 20 meters, other than the ones that are used for calibration. And all of Landsats are at 30 meters. So you have some differences that you could take advantage of one or the other cases as you need to. And this just shows an example of where these bands are placed. If you ignore MODIS and ASTER at the bottom, and you look at the Landsat 7, which is still operating, and then we have 8 and 9, which is in the middle, and then the Sentinel 2 is up at the top. Landsat 7 had 8 bands, and you see blue, green, and red are bands 1, 2, and 3. The near infrared band is band 4. The shortwave, this 1500 nanometer band, is band 5. Then this band at around 2200 nanometers, and the kind of the long end of the solar spectrum that comes to Earth. That's called band 7. And there's a reason for that, because the thermal band is called band 6. And so it has, the things are numbered. The number means nothing. It just is the order that they were accepted. That band was accepted as part of the satellite when it was designed. And then band 8 is a very wide band crossing most of the visible and the near infrared. And by collecting all that energy across that whole broad spectral range, then you can have a much higher spatial resolution. So band 8 is a 10 nanometer panchromatic band for Landsat. Landsat 8 and 9 have more or less the same, pretty similar bands, except they have a narrower panchromatic band, but they've also added a band in the blue, that in the shorter wavelength blue region for calibration. It's for aerosol calibration. They have a band 6 and 7. They're not quite the same size. And then they have 2 thermal bands instead of 1. they have a calibration band in the middle of this 1400 water absorption feature. So the gray lines are where light reaches the Earth's surface. That's has high transmission through the whole atmosphere. And the areas where it's white are the areas where, like here, there's really no lights getting to the Earth's surface at that wavelength. And so that band is used for estimating cirrus clouds, was what it was, I think, what it was put in there for. And then the Sentinel 2s have their blue, green, and red are more or less in the same wavelengths, even if they're not the same size. Then the near infrared band, they have 4 very narrow bands that cross the red to the near infrared region to let you map very carefully that red edge slope. And then 2 bands in these shortwave infrared, the same as the 6 and 7 on Landsat, but no thermal bands. But they do have 3 calibration bands. They have an aerosol band at 1, and then they have a water vapor band, and then they have the ice band for cirrus clouds. And so that's the band. You see where the bands are placed on these things. So in this example for Landsat, which was from July 16th, it shows Lake Mead, and the green line shows the historic high in 1984 and what it is today. It's lost about 1/3 of its capacity. And then another example for Shasta Lake, which is also quite seriously lost its water. And another example for Landsat, this is by combining Sentinel 2 and Landsat, you have this very high spatial resolution series. So with the time series, the graph shows for a 1-year time series, you see when it greens up. And then for alfalfa, you see it got cut at this, 180 days or something. Then it grows back up again and it's cut again at 230 or something days. And then it got cut again. And then now it's, it's near the end of the growing season. So it just not harvest again after that. But so you can see both in terms of what a pixel is doing over time, as well as you see it spatially. So you can use both of those kinds of information. And the entire Landsat archive and the entire Sentinel archive, which is much younger, are both available on the Google Cloud, just to say that you don't always have to go and start from scratch and get all the data sets yourselves. You can take advantage of these cloud collections to use that don't require you to download all the data. At the continental and global scales, there's lots of other kinds of questions, things related to ocean currents and phytoplankton and harmful algal blooms. Everybody's interested in GPP and NPP still with these data sets, droughts and extreme weather, things related to losses of major crop, in terms of famine prediction, or in terms of economics, if you're interested in the cost of the grain that might be lost to extreme weather, and things that are interested in changing the forest cover, for instance. And there are several of these instruments that are available to you to use. So this example is from VIIRS. It's more or less the replacement. It's part of the joint satellite program between NOAA and the Defense Department, and the series with VIIRS is going to continue into the late 2030s. So this is the instrument you're going to have available. It has 22 bands compared to MODIS's 36, but they're kind of the most important 22. And it has very good nightlight information. So this is not the best rendition. It's the best I could get in terms of the way anyway, it's the best I could download and make a picture of. But people use the nightlight data for looking at social economic questions. And and other kinds of information that would tell you about how energy is being used and how many, something about population density and also the economic resources. The nightlight data gives you information. Here's Hurricane Ida as it came ashore, showing it with the nightlight data scattering off the top of the hurricane. And then here you see the hurricane in the day with from VIIRS. VIIRS is flown on a platform called Suomi NPP mission. Suomi is a famous climatologist, well-respected climatologist, early person that used satellite data, and it's a NASA mission to bridge between the VIIRS, and what is the JPSS joint program between NOAA and NASA, NOAA and the military. NOAA's got lots of operational products. This one is called Vegetation Health Product. It combines a vegetation condition index, a temperature condition index, and a vegetation health index to come up with a kind of composite index for health globally, for vegetation health. So these are kinds of things that are potentially of interest. The Sentinel-3 is another one of the European Sentinel missions. And it has two instruments, this LSSTR and the OLCI. I think it's operational line color index or imager is what I think. I forget what they call, what the instrument names are, but this shows you where the bands are. It has a lot of bands in the visible part of the spectrum, 400 to 700 nanometers, and a few in the near infrared. The OLCI, the LSSTR, has a few bands in that region that sort of overlap, so you can use them together, but then it has both these shortwave infrared bands at the 3 to 4 micron range, and then at the 10 to 12, where it's the normal for measuring temperature, where it's that band. But it's being flown in tandem with an instrument called FLEX that's going to measure fluorescence. And FLEX, if the flights are going from right to left across the image, so FLEX is in front of the Sentinel-3, and it's in the right, very closely coordinated in the center of the swath of the Sentinel-3, and it measures the two oxygen bands, oxygen A and B bands, and it has about 200 bands that measure very narrow spectral region between 500 nanometers and 800 nanometers, so that you have the sort of spectral information, the visible information around those oxygen absorption bands to be able to interpret chlorophyll fluorescence is what they're doing. And then by having it flown in tandem with the Sentinel-3, because those imagers have a broader swath and they cover other parts of the spectrum, you have a much deeper set of information to interpret the fluorescence data from. And what they're doing is measuring the reflectance at these two 687 and 760 nanometers to estimate fluorescence. So these are in these kind of spots where there's very little terrestrial reflectance from those bands, those narrow bands. Similarly, there's an instrument on the space station called OCO3, which is for the CO2. It's just turned around. CO2 is the name of the instrument, and it's measuring solar induced fluorescence. And this shows a path of it crossing from outside of a marine area across a landscape that's varying vegetation. So the color in the fluorescence is varying as the density of the vegetation increases. And then lastly, to say that there's a geostationary satellite that's planned called Geocard that will measure the entire US and somewhat of Canada and Mexico, North America, to continuously, since geostationary, it'll measure it continuously to look for patterns of chlorophyll fluorescence as a way of understanding where there are changes in gross primary productivity is the principal objective of this mission. And then I have a few more minutes, so I just want to mention some of the hyperspectral remote sensing measurements. These things use hundreds of bands. Most of them today are somewhere between 200 and 400 bands across the visible and the reflected infrared. So you have quite narrow bandwidths. And so using that, you can then measure fairly precisely where the absorption maximum is and what the shape of it is, if it's a simple shape or has some other kind of complex shape that would show that it's more than one thing superimposed. And they're used to measure different kinds of carbon molecules, whether it's CO2 or methane or carbon monoxide. Atmospheric dust is another interest in smoke plumes. And there's lots and lots of instruments. DESIS, HISUI, PRISMA are all in orbit right now. NMAP's going into orbit. EMIT, it'll be on the space station. SBG and CHIME are being coordinated between US, NASA, and ESA, and they will be global mapping missions like the Landsat mission. And then biodiversity is a French CNES mission. The methane sat, oh, I got a little typo in there. Methane sat is being built by a subsidiary of the Environmental Defense Fund, and it's supposed to launch next year about this time. And it uses bands in the mid-infrared and to detect methane. Their band methane's got absorptions at 2.3 microns and 7.65 microns, and so you can use absorptions at those bands to identify and localize where methane is being emitted from. And I would like to tell you that the CARB, California Air Resources Board, is working on coordinating a satellite that's being built with investor funds and built by Planet, which is the Bay Area satellite. They have like a constellation, like a GPS of satellites, of about 25 satellites with 4 bands each, these cheap satellites, and they cross-calibrate them. That's the company. Anyway, they are going to be monitoring for methane. The current status of that project is the detector array is being built at JPL. That's the kind of most critical part, and there's a long delay in getting the detector arrays from the company that builds them. So was kind of a critical step. But anyway, the other parts are being developed at Planet. So there's 2 of them that are coming up probably next year. On the space station is the EMIT I mentioned. It was designed to measure the sources of dust in the atmosphere, and the dust coming from major arid regions. And the problem with atmospheric dust is that for the radiative budget of the Earth, that depending on the kind of dust that it is, if it's a clay particle or if it's a more of an iron rich or some other kind of molecule, they have different absorption features because of their chemistries. And so if you know what the dust is, what the composition of the dust is, you can better estimate the sign of the impact on the radiative budget. Does it, is it reflecting more or is it absorbing more? And it has a lot of the air in the radiative budget is due to the what's going on with the dust molecules. So that's what that one's for. The SBG and the CHIME are these major contributions for NASA and ESA for global monitoring, and it's going to be able to measure different plant pigments in plants, whether they're chlorophyll or carotene, if they're toxic cyanobacteria, or if there are different algal phyla, and the marine algal phyla have different pigments, so you can identify what, if it's what kind of brown algae or golden brown or whatever phyla it is. And then Other things like quantifying the burning temperature. If you would, because they have so many bands, they can actually get a good estimate of what the burning temperature is by estimating the shape of the curve. And you can look at before and after effects and map, look for look for islands that survive vegetation or hot spots that are still hot out there, all kinds of different things. And this just shows you some examples of different types of vegetation from different areas, desert and boreal forest and mangrove forest and the Great Barrier Reef, agriculture, grasslands, whatever, temperate forests and snow-covered places. And then what they look like in terms of the numbers of spectral dimensions they have. And so they use a program called the minimum noise fraction that is kind of decomposes the signal into its essential signals. And so from that, they can see what's the dimensionality of these different kinds of regions and what kind of, what are the bands that are important in those areas. So that's one of the examples. And for biodiversity, it's another kind of example. We have so many spectral bands, you can tell one plant species from another, but you can also do things like estimate alpha and beta diversity using this kind of data. And this is just an example from a paper from the Western Ghats in Southwest India. This is an area that's considered a biodiversity hotspot area, but it's under high pressure from the population density of the surrounding areas. So we were looking at mapping biodiversity patterns in this region. These data sets that are on the space station, there's the OCO3 that does fluorescence, the EcoStress that's a thermal sensor, multi-band thermal sensor, JEDI that's a lidar, and HISUI and DESIS that are hyperspectral imagers. And you could use those data together to the synergies between them to identify a lot more information. So with that, I want to stop and give you a chance to ask me some questions. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Susan. We did have a couple questions come in for you, primarily from James Jarrett. He's wondering, I went to the NASA website to view the satellite data, and the data file is in HDF format. Do you know how to view that?
Yeah, it's a unique format that NASA developed to do that, but there should be in most, like if you use ArcGIS or most software packages for image processing, they will take in that HDF format. And if you want to get a hold of me afterwards, I can, I'll send you Mui Lei, my technician, and she'll show you how to do it.
Awesome. We'll put your email in the chat then. He also had another comment saying that this was super helpful to have the overview of the data and the satellites. The next step would be how to get to the data, view it, and analyze it. Do you have any comments or suggestions on viewing and analyzing the data that is coming out from these satellites?
Well, yes, these things are not always easy to figure out, and it takes time. And different satellites, depending on who built them and under what kind of conditions, is it a PI-driven instrument, or is it a the agency's operational instrument? They have different pathways to get to them. I would suggest you first go to the Land Processes DAC, the LP DAC. It's located at Sioux Falls, next to, it's connected to the Landsat archive, but it's funded by NASA. They have many of these data sets are there. And even the Landsat archive has a lot of things beyond Landsat. Some of them you just have to do a query search for. And if you would, if anybody wants it, I will post a paper that we wrote, that I wrote last January, or I mean, it was published last January, on a lot of these new satellites for a journal called Ecosystem Processes. And in the last few pages of there's a table in there that has sort of, where do you get the data? Where do you get the codes to process the data? Or, you know, do this analysis. And it's got about 3 pages of those connections. And that might be another place you could start. You know, the easiest thing is to find somebody around here that's working with Landsat data. So in LAWR, Yufang Jen is on the faculty, and she's routinely doing it, and she could direct you to someone else. Robert Hyman's in ESP department is another source you can use. Troy, I can't all of a sudden they went blank on his last name. He in plant sciences department. He's very active in remote sensing. So, and if I think long enough, man, there are probably 15 other people. But you know, asking somebody that's that's using the data is the easiest way to figure it out. And you know, we have a lot of data in our lab, my lab too, and connections. So I can try to see what we can do to help you find the data you want.
Wonderful. Yes. So I put Susan's email in the chat box for attendees if you want to reach out to her and get connected to the right people that are using the data that she mentioned. I'm sure she'll welcome that and pointing you in the right direction for these things. Yeah. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Sorry?
I said, okay.
My bad. I don't see any other questions in the chat at the moment. So we'll wait another second here in case somebody's still formulating or typing one. But one question that I sort of was wondering, you had mentioned the methane leaks from the methane fact. How small of a methane leak can be detected by these satellites?
Well, I think it's not clear, or it's not clear to me since I'm not doing that research. But you know, it depends a little bit on how fast are the winds blowing by it, right? Because that's diluting the plume. If it's not very windy, a smaller signal can be detected than a larger one. But they're down to the point where I just can't remember people's name. I think it's Brian Durian. He used to be at JPL, and he started a lot of the methane stuff, routinely monitoring. And he did a big survey of methane leaks in California 2 years ago, and that I can get you a publication for that. But CARB has been working with JPL on doing this airborne mapping that Durian's been doing, and they detect leaks in pipes, you know, individual pipes, and then they notify whoever owns it, and many of them have gone out and they fixed them, so they can be fairly small. I think if you really wanted to say map all of the pipelines in California, you might want to use an airplane because you can get much higher spatial resolution, so you could detect a smaller leak. But like a few years ago in around Thousand Oaks, California had they had a big methane, you know, big gas pipe leak in the suburb down there a few years ago, and that was easily seen from satellite.
Right.
But it was a big.
It was big.
They had to evacuate a whole bunch of people and houses out of there for months on end while they figured out how to fix it. I was gonna, if you let's see.
So what are we looking at here?
Well, this is a EcoStress, so it's a thermal imager, and it's showing as the fire spread, that Calder fire, up towards Lake Tahoe, as it spread on different days, you see where the active fire was, and when the satellite went over. So it's the instantaneous part. Not presumably there was more continuous in between, but you see how it spread and where it was active, and even the fact that it jumped huge distances is kind of interesting.
Very interesting. Yes.
So that's eco-stress data from the space station.
Wow. Okay. So you could see the pattern where the fires are going and match that with the winds, and just sort of predict where it's going to go next, hopefully.
Yeah, it's more than just the winds, because of course the topography and then the vegetation density also affect the rate of the spread. But yes, if you were trying to figure out what would you do to make it a sustainable forest, right, in the future, this kind of information might help you to understand where you had very rapid spread and where it spread more slowly.
Awesome. Very, very interesting indeed.
Anyway, I had to do that one separate. That was because I couldn't make the video work in my when it was in the PowerPoint, but it worked just fine outside of it.
Right. Well, I'm glad that you brought that up and shared it with everyone.
Yeah. All right.
Well, I'm not seeing any final questions here, so I think we will wrap it up. As I mentioned, Susan's email is in the chat. We have recorded this presentation, so once I upload it onto YouTube and put it on our website, I'll send out an email to everybody. But otherwise, I want to say thank you so much, Susan, for giving this presentation, and I hope everybody gained a lot from it.
All right. Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.
All right. Bye. Bye, everybody.